He kicked out my wife and assistant after they tried to kick my son out of the house. Eric stood on the edge of the cliff that was his relationship with Sarah, watching pieces of their 8 years together crumble into the abyss below. The day he proposed was supposed to be the pinnacle of their love story. 8 years of shared experiences, dreams, and the kind of trust that only time can build. Yet, when Sarah didn't give him the immediate yes he had so longed for and instead asked for time to think, something shifted. It wasn't just in her response, it was in her entire demeanor afterward. The memory of that evening haunted him. He had chosen the location meticulously, a quaint lakeside spot where they had spent countless Sundays, a place brimming with their laughter and shared secret. The evening sun dipped low, painting the horizon with streaks of orange and purple as he knelt on one knee, the small velvet box trembling slightly in his hand. "Sarah," he had begun, voice steady but his heart pounding, "I've loved you since the moment I met you. Will you marry me?" For a brief moment, her face lit up with an emotion he couldn't quite read. Surprise? Joy? Something else entirely? But the smile faltered, her eyes darting away from his as she responded, "Eric, I need to think about this." Her words hit like a gut punch. In the silence that followed, the only sound was the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore. Eric tried to mask his disappointment, standing awkwardly as Sarah avoided his gaze, her fingers fidgeting nervously. "Of course," he managed to say, his voice tight as he closed the box and slid it back into his pocket. The days that followed were no less agonizing. Sarah became distant, almost unrecognizable. Eric, a man who prided himself on his ability to read her, found himself unable to connect. It started subtly. She spent more time on her phone, her screen lighting up with notifications she'd quickly swipe away. Her laughter, once warm and frequent, became sparse and hollow. Even their routine evening chats, where they once spoke about everything from work frustrations to childhood dreams, turned into one-sided monologues, with Eric doing most of the talking while Sarah offered only vague nods or distracted hums. At first, Eric chalked it up to the pressure of his proposal. He reminded himself that marriage was a big step, and it was only natural for Sarah to need time. But as the days stretched into weeks, his unease grew. She started coming home later than usual, often with the excuse of work running late or grabbing drinks with colleagues. Yet, she never smelled like a bar, and there was something almost rehearsed about the way she explained herself. One evening, Eric decided to test the waters. As Sarah sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, he asked casually, "So, have you had a chance to think about the proposal?" Her reaction was telling. Her shoulders tensed, her grip on the phone tightening before she placed its screen down on the coffee table. "I have," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I just need a little more time, Eric. It's not that I don't love you, it's just a lot to process." He wanted to believe her. He really did. But doubt had already taken root in his mind, and her increasing aloofness only watered it. Conversations became strained, every word between them feeling like a dance on eggshells. Eric began to notice the small details he had overlooked before. How she no longer called him love or babe, opting instead for his name, as if it created some sort of barrier. How she no longer left her phone unattended, always keeping it within arm's reach or tucked into her bag. One night, as they lay in bed, the distance between them felt insurmountable. Eric reached out, placing a tentative hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, are we okay?" he asked softly. She stiffened beneath his touch, her back to him. "Why would you even ask that?" she responded, her tone defensive. "Because," he hesitated, not wanting to sound accusatory. "You've been different. Distant. I feel like I'm losing you." Sarah sighed heavily, sitting up and rubbing her temples. "Eric, I've just been under a lot of stress, okay? Work is crazy, and now this proposal. I just need some space to figure things out." Space. That word echoed in Eric's mind long after Sarah turned off the light and settled back into bed. What did space mean? Was she unsure about their future together, or was it something or someone else? The thought gnawed at him. Days turned into a blur of second-guessing. Eric found himself analyzing every interaction, every text Sarah received, and every glance she avoided. He tried to push his suspicions aside, convincing himself that he was being paranoid. But his intuition whispered otherwise. The tipping point came one Saturday when Sarah announced, almost out of nowhere, that she was going to visit a college friend in another town for the weekend. "It's been so long since we caught up," she said, her tone light but her words overly deliberate. Eric nodded, masking his skepticism. He trusted her, or at least he wanted to. But as she packed her overnight bag and left the house, something inside him snapped. He couldn't keep ignoring the nagging feeling that something was wrong. In her absence, He found himself spiraling into a frenzy of doubt and paranoia. Every interaction they'd shared in recent weeks replayed in his mind like a broken record. The once strong foundation of their relationship now felt like a house of cards teetering on the edge of collapse. When Sarah returned that Sunday evening, her demeanor was almost jarringly casual, as if nothing had happened. She greeted him with a breezy hey, dropping her bag by the door and heading straight for the shower. But Eric noticed her unease, how her laughter was forced when he joked about the weekend, how she deflected his questions about her trip. That night, as Sarah slept beside him, Eric lay awake, his thoughts racing. He couldn't escape the feeling that their relationship, once so full of promise, was now hanging by a thread. And as he stared at the ceiling, he couldn't help but wonder, was it him? Had he done something wrong? Or was Sarah hiding a truth that he wasn't ready to face? The weight of it all pressed down on him, leaving Eric feeling more alone than ever, despite the woman he loved lying just inches away. The tension in Eric's life was no longer something he could ignore. It clung to him like a second skin, ever present and suffocating. Sarah's distance had shifted from something subtle to something glaring. Her phone, always glued to her hand, her vague answers about her late nights, her casual disregard for the man who had knelt down to ask her to spend her life with him, it was all too much to bear. And though Eric had tried to convince himself that he was imagining things, the gnawing doubt in his mind refused to fade. It started innocuously enough, with Eric contemplating whether he could confront her more directly, but every time he opened his mouth, Sarah would deflect or grow irritated, accusing him of being paranoid or controlling. Yet her words didn't match her behavior. She had begun wearing perfume to work, something she never used to do. She spent extra time on her hair, her wardrobe shifting from the comfortable styles she used to favor to outfits that seemed unnecessarily polished for her office job. Eric wanted to believe that these were normal changes, maybe an attempt on her part to rejuvenate her self-esteem or her professional confidence. But when she began disappearing on weekends, often citing work emergencies or impromptu meetings with friends he had never heard of, Eric felt a crack form in the dam of his patience. One evening, Sarah's phone buzzed on the counter while she was upstairs. Eric glanced at it instinctively, his eyes catching a preview of the message on the lock screen. "Can't stop thinking about you. Last night was amazing." The message was from someone named Peter. He felt the ground shift beneath him. His first reaction was to tell himself he must have misunderstood, but the sinking feeling in his gut told him otherwise. When Sarah returned downstairs, she grabbed the phone quickly and slid it into her pocket without a word, not noticing Eric's pale expression. That night, as she lay asleep beside him, Eric made a decision that he never thought he would have to make in their 8 years together. He needed answers. Real, undeniable answers. The following morning, Eric contacted a private investigator. It felt like a betrayal in itself, an invasion of the privacy of the woman he loved. But he couldn't live in the limbo of uncertainty any longer. The investigator, a man named Greg, assured him that he would get to the bottom of the situation discreetly. The next week was one of the longest of Eric's life. He went through the motions of his day, going to work, pretending to be fine, but inside, he was a tempest of nerves. He couldn't look at Sarah without feeling a mixture of anger and heartbreak, and her continued evasiveness only fanned the flames of his suspicion. Every time her phone buzzed, every time she smiled at a message or laughed quietly to herself, Eric felt like his chest was being crushed. It didn't take Greg long to deliver the information Eric feared. When the private investigator handed over the folder containing photos, timestamps, and details of Sarah's activities, Eric's hands shook as he opened it. There it was, plain as day. Sarah had been spending time with a coworker named Peter, a man Eric had only heard in passing when Sarah mentioned him during casual conversations about work. There were photos of them leaving a bar together late at night, her hand resting lightly on Peter's arm as they laughed. Another showed them sitting in a park, heads leaned close together, sharing what looked like an intimate conversation. The most damning evidence was a series of photos of them outside Peter's car, Sarah leaning in close as their faces touched. It wasn't difficult to deduce what had happened. Eric's stomach churned as he stared at the images. The woman he had loved for nearly a decade, the woman he had planned to marry, was now a stranger to him. How had it come to this? He felt humiliation burn through him like fire. All the moments he had blamed himself, doubted himself, wondered if he was the problem, only to learn that Sarah had been betraying him in ways he couldn't fathom. That night, when Sarah came home, Eric couldn't hold it in any longer. He sat her down at the dining table, his hands gripping the edge to keep them from shaking. "I know," he said simply, his voice low and strained. Sarah blinked at him, her confusion genuine at first, but then she seemed to realize what he meant. Her face paled. "Eric, what?" "I know about Peter," Eric interrupted, his voice rising. I know about the late nights, the work meetings, the trips out of town. I know everything. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she shook her head. Eric, it's not what you think. It was just a kiss. A kiss? Eric's laugh was bitter and hollow. You expect me to believe that after everything? After seeing you with him? It wasn't serious, she insisted, her voice trembling. It didn't mean anything. I was just confused, okay? I didn't know how to handle things after you proposed. I panicked. Eric stared at her, his heart breaking with every word. You panicked? So instead of talking to me, instead of telling me you weren't ready, you decided to turn to someone else? Do you know what this feels like, Sarah? Do you know how humiliating it is to realize the person you love has been lying to your face? I wasn't lying, she began, but Eric cut her off. You've been lying every single day, Sarah. You've been lying with every excuse, every late night, every fake smile. You didn't even have the decency to tell me the truth. I had to hire someone to find out? Her face crumpled at his words, and she buried her head in her hands. I didn't mean for it to happen, she whispered. I love you, Eric. I do. I made a mistake. A mistake? Eric stood abruptly, pacing the room. A mistake is forgetting to take out the trash, Sarah. This is a betrayal. The silence between them was deafening. Eric looked at her, the woman he had envisioned spending the rest of his life with, and felt nothing but emptiness. He had fought so hard for their relationship, had given her everything he had, and in return, she had torn it all apart. In the days that followed, things between them were strained beyond repair. Sarah begged for forgiveness, claiming that the kiss meant nothing, that she wanted to rebuild what they had. But for Eric, the damage was done. Every time he looked at her, he saw the photos in the folder, saw her leaning into Peter's car, saw the betrayal etched into her every move. The love they had once shared felt like a distant memory, replaced by an ache that refused to subside. Eric found himself withdrawing from Sarah, unable to bear the weight of her presence. He no longer believed her reassurances or her tears. The woman he had loved was gone, replaced by someone he didn't recognize. And though he hadn't yet decided what the future held for them, one thing was certain: things would never be the same. Eric had tried to rebuild the fractured remains of their relationship, but the betrayal never truly left his mind. Every time Sarah promised him that she was done with Peter and that the kiss had been a fleeting mistake, something in her tone felt hollow. Her apologies came with a desperation he couldn't quite trust, and her reassurances sounded more like someone covering their tracks than someone genuinely remorseful. Eric wanted to believe her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something she wasn't telling him. The first crack in her new narrative came a few weeks after their confrontation. Eric was cleaning the living room while Sarah was at work, trying to distract himself from the constant replay of their arguments in his mind. As he moved some magazines off the coffee table, a folded piece of paper fluttered to the floor. It was tucked into one of the pages of a book Sarah had been reading recently. Curious, he picked it up and opened it, his stomach immediately dropping at the sight of Peter's handwriting. It wasn't much, a hastily written note, but it was damning all the same. Last night was incredible. I'll never forget how you looked at me. Let's meet again soon. P. Eric's hands trembled as he read the words. His breathing quickened, his mind racing. Last night? The note was recent, far too recent for Sarah's claims of having ended things with Peter to hold any weight. She had looked him in the eyes, begged him to believe that it had all been a mistake, and yet here was proof that she had continued to see Peter, continued to betray him. When Sarah came home that evening, Eric didn't bother with pleasantries. He confronted her immediately, shoving the note in her direction. Care to explain this? Sarah froze in the doorway, her face draining of color as she stared at the piece of paper in his hand. Eric, I can explain. Explain? Eric's voice rose, sharp and bitter. Explain what, Sarah? That you've been lying to me this whole time? That you never stopped seeing him? Or maybe you can explain why I've been sitting here, trying to fix something you've been actively destroying behind my back. It's not what it looks like, she stammered, her words coming out in a rush. Peter, he wrote that without my encouragement. I haven't seen him. Do you think I'm stupid? Eric shouted, his anger finally boiling over. This isn't just some random love note from a coworker, Sarah. This is proof that you've been lying to me every single day. Again, tears welled up in her eyes as she tried to deny it, but her excuses sounded weaker and more rehearsed with every word. Eric couldn't stand to look at her. He turned away, feeling the weight of his humiliation crush him. How could he have believed her, even for a second? How could he have let her convince him that they had a chance at fixing this? But the note was only the beginning. As the days passed, Eric couldn't stop himself from digging deeper. If Sarah had lied about Peter, what else was she hiding? His paranoia drove him to actions he never thought he was capable of, checking her phone when she wasn't looking, logging into their shared laptop to go through her messages, and scouring her social media for any hint of betrayal. That's when he discovered Jason. The first clue came from a string of messages he found in Sarah's email, buried under an innocuous subject line. The emails were sent weeks before their confrontation about Peter, and they painted a picture that was just as devastating. Jason, it seemed, wasn't just an emotional confidant for Sarah. He was something far more insidious. The messages were casual at first, filled with jokes and light-hearted banter that could have easily been mistaken for friendly exchanges. But as Eric scrolled further back, the tone shifted. Jason wrote about how much he missed seeing her smile, how her laughter brightened his day. He called her special, irreplaceable, and the one thing keeping him sane. And Sarah's responses were just as damning. She confided in Jason about her doubts regarding Eric, about how she felt trapped and unsure about her future. She told him he was the only person who truly understood her, the only one she could be herself with. But it didn't stop there. The messages quickly took on a physical element. Jason referenced their time together in ways that made Eric's skin crawl. One email, in particular, stood out. "I can still feel the warmth of your touch. I don't know how I'm supposed to go back to pretending like nothing happened. I need to see you again. Soon." Eric stared at the screen, his vision blurring with tears of rage and despair. This wasn't just an emotional affair. Sarah had been physically involved with Jason as well. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer. While he had been agonizing over Peter, over the kiss she claimed was a one-time mistake, she had been betraying him with someone else entirely. When he confronted her about Jason, Sarah's reaction was almost comically predictable. She denied it at first, accused him of invading her privacy, tried to deflect by bringing up his lack of trust and his obsessive behavior. But when Eric showed her the emails, her protests fell silent. "It wasn't serious," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for it to go that far." Eric laughed bitterly, the sound devoid of humor. "Not serious? You've been cheating on me with 2 different men, Sarah. Do you even hear yourself? Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To us?" "I was confused," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know how to handle everything. After you proposed, I felt suffocated. I didn't know how to tell you. So you decided to cheat on me instead?" Eric interrupted, his voice rising. "You decided to humiliate me? To lie to me, over and over again? Do you know what it feels like to have the person you love betray you in every possible way?" Sarah sobbed, but her tears did nothing to soften Eric's anger. He felt broken in ways he couldn't even articulate. The woman he had loved, the woman he had wanted to spend his life with, had systematically destroyed every ounce of trust he had in her. In the days that followed, Eric couldn't bring himself to speak to her. He avoided her as much as possible, his mind consumed by the weight of her betrayals. He replayed every moment of their relationship in his head, searching for the signs he had missed, the moments when he should have known. But no matter how much he thought about it, he couldn't understand how Sarah could have done this to him. How she could have looked him in the eyes, told him she loved him, and then gone to Jason and Peter behind his back. Sarah's apologies became increasingly frantic as the days turned into weeks. She begged him to forgive her, swore that she would do whatever it took to make things right. But her words felt hollow, her promises meaningless. Eric couldn't trust her anymore, couldn't believe anything she said. He felt like a shadow of himself, a man stripped of his dignity and self-worth. The woman he had once considered his partner, his best friend, had humiliated him in ways he never thought possible. And as he sat alone in their once shared home, surrounded by the remnants of their life together, Eric couldn't help but wonder if he would ever be able to put the pieces of himself back together. Eric's world, already teetering on the brink of collapse, seemed to shatter further with every new discovery. Sarah's betrayals felt endless, a maze of deception that deepened his humiliation and left him questioning the very fabric of their 8-year relationship. After uncovering her physical and emotional infidelity with both Peter and Jason, Eric thought there was nothing more left to unravel. But the truth had a cruel way of revealing itself in layers, each more agonizing than the last. It began when Eric noticed Sarah behaving strangely around her phone again. After their last confrontation, she had made an effort to leave her phone lying around, almost as a show of transparency. But recently, she had resumed her old habits, keeping it close, silencing notifications, and tilting the screen away whenever Eric was nearby. If there was one thing Eric had learned through this ordeal, it was that Sarah's defensiveness always signaled another secret waiting to be uncovered. One evening, as Sarah showered, Eric decided to check her phone again. His heart raced as he picked it up, knowing he was crossing a line but feeling justified after everything she had hidden from him. It didn't take long to find something. Among her chat apps, there was a conversation with someone named Lucas, a coworker Eric vaguely remembered her mentioning once or twice. His stomach sank as he scrolled through their messages, each one more incriminating than the last. Unlike the messages with Jason, which had quickly escalated into flirtation and physical intimacy, the exchanges with Lucas were deeply personal. Sarah poured her heart out to him, venting about her life, her insecurities, and most painfully, about Eric. She painted a picture of their relationship that was almost unrecognizable to Eric, a narrative where she was the victim, and he was the source of all her unhappiness. One message stood out in particular: "Lucas, I feel like I'm suffocating. Eric doesn't understand me anymore. He's always so focused on fixing things, but he never stops to ask how I really feel. You're the only person I can talk to about this." Eric felt the familiar sting of betrayal, but this time it was mixed with an overwhelming sense of shame. She wasn't just confiding in another man, she was tearing him down, reducing him to a caricature of himself. The man she described in those messages was cold, distant, and oblivious, a far cry from the Eric who had spent sleepless nights trying to figure out how to salvage their relationship, who had bent over backward to give Sarah the space and support she claimed she needed. The messages continued, revealing the depth of their emotional connection. Lucas responded with empathy and validation, often criticizing Eric in subtle ways that fueled Sarah's resentment. "You deserve someone who sees you for who you are," one message read. "Someone who listens and makes you feel valued. I hate seeing you so unhappy." Eric clenched his fists as he read the words. Lucas had become a confidant, a safe haven for Sarah to air her grievances and escape the consequences of her actions. But what hurt the most was that Sarah had allowed it, encouraged it, even. She had chosen to seek solace in someone else rather than face the problems in their relationship head-on. And once again, Eric found himself in the humiliating position of playing second fiddle to another man. As he scrolled further, he found evidence that their emotional connection had spilled over into something more tangible. Sarah and Lucas frequently met for coffee or lunch outside of work, meetings she had never mentioned to Eric. In one message, Lucas suggested they take a day trip together to clear her mind, to which Sarah had replied, "I'd love that. I need to get away from everything for a while." The thought of Sarah spending time alone with Lucas, laughing and sharing her deepest thoughts, made Eric's blood boil. She had been withdrawing from him for months, claiming she needed space, only to give that space to someone else. Every moment she spent with Lucas was a moment stolen from their relationship, another brick removed from the crumbling foundation of their life together. When Sarah returned from the shower, Eric confronted her immediately. He didn't bother with preamble or subtlety. "How long has it been going on with Lucas?" he demanded, holding up her phone. Sarah froze, her face a mask of shock and guilt. "Eric, what are you doing with my phone?" "Don't deflect," Eric snapped, his voice trembling with anger. "I read the messages, Sarah. All of them. The lunches, the day trips, the late-night texts where you poured your heart out to him. How long?" "It's not what you think," she stammered, her voice shaking. "Lucas is just a friend. He's been there for me when you what?" Eric interrupted, his voice rising. "When you needed someone to trash me to. When you needed someone to validate your lies and make you feel better about all the ways you've betrayed me." Tears filled Sarah's eyes, but Eric wasn't moved. He had seen this act before, the tearful apologies and the promises to change. He had believed her before, given her the benefit of the doubt, and every time, she had proven him wrong. This time was no different. "You don't understand," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I've been feeling so alone, Eric. After everything with Peter and Jason, I didn't know how to talk to you anymore. Lucas was just someone I could lean on." "Someone you could lean on?" Eric repeated, his voice dripping with bitterness. "You mean someone you could replace me with? Don't you see what you're doing, Sarah? Every time things get hard, you run to someone else instead of facing it with me. You don't want to fix this relationship, you want an escape." Sarah sobbed, but Eric felt no sympathy. He had given her everything he had, sacrificed his own pride and dignity to try to make things work, only to be met with more lies and betrayals. The woman he had loved for 8 years, the woman he had planned to spend the rest of his life with, had turned their relationship into a mockery. "I trusted you," Eric said, his voice raw with emotion. "Even after Peter, even after Jason, I still tried to believe that we could fix this. But you've been lying to me this whole time, haven't you? You've been hiding behind your confusion and your mistakes while you destroy everything we built together. I didn't mean to hurt you," Sarah whispered, her tears falling freely now. I didn't know what else to do. You could have talked to me, Eric said, his voice trembling. You could have fought for us. But instead, you chose them. You chose Peter, Jason, and Lucas over me, over us. And now there's nothing left to fight for. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and final. Sarah looked at him, her face a mixture of regret and desperation, but Eric couldn't bring himself to care anymore. He had spent months trying to save a relationship that Sarah had abandoned long before he even realized it was in trouble. As Eric walked out of the room, leaving Sarah alone with her tears, he felt a strange sense of clarity. The pain was still there, sharp and unrelenting, but beneath it was a quiet realization. He couldn't keep holding on to someone who had let go of him a long time ago. Eric thought he had uncovered the full scope of Sarah's betrayal, but he was wrong. Each new revelation seemed to peel back yet another layer of deceit, exposing more lies, more humiliation, and more pain. Just when he thought there was nothing left to uncover, he found out about Natalie. Natalie had always been Sarah's closest confidant, her best friend since college. Over the years, Eric had grown to trust Natalie, believing her to be an ally of their relationship. Natalie had been there for their milestones, birthdays, anniversaries, the day Eric proposed. She had clapped the loudest, cheered them on, and acted like Sarah's biggest supporter. Now, it was becoming clear that Natalie's role wasn't just as an innocent bystander. She had been an accomplice in Sarah's betrayals, actively helping her cover her tracks and providing excuses for her behavior. It began innocuously enough. One evening, as Eric went through old messages on Sarah's phone, something he now found himself doing far too often, he noticed an exchange with Natalie that sent chills down his spine. The messages were brief but telling. "Natalie, don't forget to delete that message from Peter. Eric might see it. Sarah, already done. Thanks for the reminder. Love you." Eric read the words over and over, his stomach twisting into knots. Natalie wasn't just aware of Sarah's affair with Peter, she had actively helped her hide it. Eric's mind raced as he thought back to all the times Sarah had used Natalie as an excuse for her behavior. "I'm going out with Natalie tonight," she'd say. "Natalie needed me to pick her up," or, "I stayed at Natalie's place after we went out." How many of those stories had been lies? How often had Natalie covered for Sarah while she was with someone else? As Eric dug deeper, the betrayal became even more pronounced. There were more messages, each one chipping away at his faith in the people he had trusted. "Natalie, did you tell Jason about Eric's schedule yet? You don't want him showing up when Eric's around." "Sarah, yeah, I told him. He knows when to stay away. Thanks for looking out." "Natalie, anytime. You deserve to be happy, babe. Don't let Eric guilt-trip you." Eric's chest tightened as he read the words. Natalie had painted him as the villain in all of this, encouraging Sarah to cheat and framing his attempts to fix their relationship as guilt-trip. She hadn't just turned a blind eye to Sarah's affairs, she had facilitated them. When Sarah came home that night, Eric confronted her immediately. "How long has Natalie been helping you lie to me?" he demanded, his voice shaking with rage. Sarah froze, her eyes wide with panic. "Eric, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you dare lie to me again." Eric's voice rose, the frustration and humiliation of the past weeks boiling over. "I've seen the messages, Sarah. I know Natalie has been covering for you this entire time. She's been helping you cheat on me, helping you humiliate me." Sarah's face crumpled as she realized there was no way out of this. "Eric, please," she said, her voice trembling. "Natalie was just trying to help me. She didn't mean to hurt you." "She didn't mean to hurt me?" Eric laughed bitterly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "She's been lying to my face for years, just like you have. She's been helping you sneak around behind my back, and you expect me to believe she didn't mean to hurt me?" Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she tried to defend herself, but Eric was done listening. "Do you know how humiliating this is, Sarah? Do you have any idea what it feels like to realize that not only has the woman I loved betrayed me, but her best friend, the person I thought was my friend too, has been in on it the whole time? I didn't know what else to do," Sarah sobbed. "Natalie was just trying to be there for me. She was helping you destroy me." Eric shouted, his voice breaking. "You didn't just betray me, Sarah. You made a fool of me. Every time I saw Natalie, every time I thanked her for being a good friend, she was laughing at me behind my back, wasn't she?" Sarah didn't respond, and her silence was all the confirmation Eric needed. The next day, Eric decided to confront Natalie directly. He didn't bother calling her. He wanted to see her face when he told her what he knew. He showed up at her apartment unannounced, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and anxiety. When Natalie opened the door, she looked surprised to see him. "Eric, what are you doing here? I know everything, Natalie, he said coldly, stepping past her into the apartment. I know about Peter. I know about Jason. And I know about all the lies you've been telling to help Sarah cover her tracks. Natalie's face went pale. Eric, Save it, Eric snapped. I trusted you, Natalie. I thought you were Sarah's friend, but you were my friend too. Or at least, I thought you were. But you were lying to me this whole time, weren't you? Natalie's eyes filled with tears, but Eric wasn't moved. Do you have any idea how humiliating this has been for me? He continued, his voice trembling with anger. You stood by and watched as Sarah destroyed our relationship, and instead of helping me, instead of telling her to stop, you helped her. You made excuses for her. You lied to me every single time you looked me in the eye. I was just trying to be a good friend to Sarah, Natalie said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. A good friend? Eric repeated, his tone incredulous. A good friend would have told her to stop. A good friend would have told her to come clean. You weren't being a good friend, Natalie. You were enabling her. Natalie broke down, sobbing into her hands, but Eric felt no sympathy. He had spent too long being the one who cried, the one who felt small and powerless in the face of their betrayal. Now, he was done being the victim. You and Sarah deserve each other, he said coldly, turning to leave. I hope you're happy with the mess you've made. As he walked out of Natalie's apartment, Eric felt a strange sense of clarity. The pain was still there, sharp and all-consuming, but for the first time, he felt like he was taking control of his life again. He couldn't undo the betrayals, couldn't erase the humiliation, but he could decide how to move forward. And he knew one thing for certain. He was done letting Sarah and the people who had helped her walk all over him. It was time to put himself first, to rebuild the pieces of his life that they had tried to tear apart.